So Surface asked a great question in a previous video. Where do fairy tales come from? In their words, they said, do you think this and other folk tales like this one, meaning the one that we talked about in the previous video, employ a kind of heavy use of dreamlike symbolism to get their point across, started out this way, or has the symbolism worked its way through the process of retelling and natural selection, as it were? Actually, not only do we have a good idea of how this works, we have some specific evidence of folk tales changing across time. In other words, there's evidence that stories may start out in lots of ways, but then the continuous retelling across generations and sometimes millennia does exactly what you're saying. It whittles them down into these and filters them into these highly concentrated stories with immense psychological resonance and impact in their symbols and narrative structures. Let's get into it. So the first story, I have talked about this before on the channel, but it's been a while. The first one I want to talk about is one that I brought up in a paper I published back in 2013, where I look at the story of Lady Godiva and how that evolved across the roughly 1,000 years that we've talked about this story. Now, you may not be familiar with this story, but it's one that I heard growing up as a kid, and it still found its way on to advertising labels and things like that. Like you may have heard of Godiva chocolate. That's where that comes from. Well, Lady Godiva was actually a real person. She lived in Coventry and was the ruler of Coventry in 1067. And by the 12th century, roughly about 100 years after that, you find writings about her by the monks of the day. And they write the story about how she rode through town naked in order to convince her husband, Earl Lothric of Mercia, to remit an oppressive tax. In this early version of the story, he sarcastically suggested that only if she rode through town naked would he grant this request. But she did, and the fact that no one saw her was just a miracle. And that was enough, apparently, for a 12th century monk to write down. 400 years later, a 16th century version reports that the local magistrates forbade anyone to look on her as she rode through the city. So this is a piece of the story that wasn't in the original version. It was added. And this time, she was with her husband and an entourage when she rode through town. And so great was the love of the townfolk of Godiva that no one disobeyed the command. And so her husband was compelled to remit the taxation, and she was made a hero. So folklorists studying this progression of a story noted that there's already starting to be folkloric elements added to the story. First, there's the story of a dutiful wife who performs some kind of humiliating task at the bidding of a tyrant husband in order to benefit the common people and wind up being a hero. There's another one of a clever wife or a maid who fulfills some apparently impossible condition. Or there's tales of noble heroines miraculously saved from shame. Okay, so what about after that? So the story persisted, actually, inspired yearly festivals of local women riding through Coventry to reenact the story. They're not naked, okay, so don't get excited. Now, interestingly enough, the church was actively trying to eradicate this behavior, which is itself kind of telling. What I mean by that is, if a story persists despite efforts to get rid of it, that tells you there's something very powerful about it. And that's where we're starting to get to what I've been talking about in terms of folk tales. Okay, fast forward a couple of hundred more years to the 18th century now. This is where the part where the peeping Tom part of the story was added. There was a famous tailor who looked at Godiva and was doing that. He looked, unlike all the rest of them who were looking away out of respect for her, he decided he'd take a peek, and he was struck blind. Now, the original version of that little piece of the story, they didn't even give the guy a name. But then afterwards, they added that his name was Tom. So that's where the whole peeping Tom idea comes from. That's where that comes from. So again, the folklorists look at this and say, here's another fairy tale motif. It's the fairy midwife motif found throughout folklore, where someone's given the power to see fairies is blinded by seeing things they're not supposed to see. And this is paralleled by many other stories of being blinded by otherworld visions. Now, Max Luthi, who's another folklorist, talks about this in his book. talks about this transmission of fairy tales across centuries. And he notes that folklorists have been fascinated by the fact that they seem to be so stable in their transmission over so many centuries. Now, what he says is that this stability is only partially ascribable to literary influence, which for a long time was underestimated, but now in more later scholarship, this was written in the 80s, tended to be overestimated. In his estimation, the listener's demand for the familiar, what was felt to be valid, was also a factor. The demands imposed by narrative and mnemonic techniques on narrators, as well as their artistic sense, conspired to maintain what was successful in terms of rhythm and sound and imagery. This then seems to be a lot of what is behind the stability of a folktale across many generations and retellings. Luthi theorized that folktales have similar characteristics because the oral transmission process and the psychological influences on the teller and the audience keep the story focused and stable across many generations. Cognitive anthropologists have noticed the same thing. That's what I brought into this when I noticed that they were saying very similar things. Qualities that find their way into folk tales are ones that you also see as apparently cognitively and emotionally optimal, very easy to visualize, very fascinating. They capture your attention and focus, and they seem to carry a powerful meaning to them. So things like crystal forests, or stories that have extremes in imagery, or doubles or tripling events in a rhythmic pattern. They have simple task, fulfill, lack, gain type plots, but also have a very strong reversal of fortune in them as well. These are all things that storytelling experts have always said you should try to incorporate into your story as much as you can. And this is why. I mean, if you really think about folk tales are stories that have survived hundreds of retellings. Some stories, in fact, are believed to be thousands of years old. At least we have evidence that they are thousands of years old. In truth, they're probably much, much older than that, but it would be very difficult to prove that. Nevertheless, getting back to Max Luthi again, he noted, very interestingly enough, that the famous stories of Wilhelm Grimm and Jacob Grimm, the Grimm's fairy tales, were originally collected well over 100 years ago. But it's pretty well accepted now that the Grimm brothers actually changed the stories a little bit sometimes from what they were actually hearing and collecting in their desire to collect the folk tales. So the storytellers in Europe, continuing with the tradition, however, after they wrote their famous collection of folk tales, they kept telling the stories, and folklorists coming in to investigate and listen to them noted that the changes that the Grimms put in there actually were changed back in the continued oral tradition. Okay, so for example, in the story Rapunzel, when the prince finally makes his way into the tower and finds that Rapunzel's not there anymore, he is overwhelmed with grief and despair in the Grimm's version of this, and jumps from the tower. But this is actually a deviation from a typical folk tale telling, where in a typical folk tale, you don't get into the inner dynamics and the inner psychology of the characters. They tend to be more symbolic and very concrete on the surface, because that's easier to think. So the original telling probably didn't have that. That was probably Grimm adding a little bit of literary flourish to the oral tradition. Nevertheless, the folklorists that went out after the book was published discovered that it went back to the original version, which was that the witch just tossed him out of the tower. So it wasn't the psychological explanation, if you get what I mean. So in Luthi's words, he says, in the tradition, the oral tradition, it corrects itself. In two later narratives derived independently, that passage about the prince jumping from the tower is corrected to a jumping from the tower which is not attributed to a psychological cause. In other words, it's a physical cause. The witch throws him from the tower. Okay. So The oral tradition, then, you can say, passes through this process of self-correction over time. Now, essentially, this is only a factor in oral storytelling. So when you're talking about folk tales or fairy tales, what you're doing is you're looking at a very specific kind of story. Anybody can write down a story now. And since the invention of words and letters and writing, and many people have. So it's easy, though, to look at those stories and compare them to folk tales and keep them at the same level, but they're really not. A folk tale is one that survived so many tellings and retellings and retellings that it's very, very concentrated. And you have this process that condenses down all of the symbolic, the imagistic, and the easy to visualize language, and all of the things that those things can typically symbolize in a universal sense are going to be represented in folktales, which is why they're so useful to study for psychology. And, von Franz noticed this many, many, many years ago, and did this all the way up until the 90s when she died. And of course, many, many Jungians have noticed the same thing and found that these folktales, because of this condensing process, are even richer than a dream would be to interpret. But you don't get information that's relevant to the individual, you get information that's relevant to the species. And that's why it's so fascinating. One final note, in the notes and description here, I'm going to include a link to a paper that talks about the roots of Indo-European folk tales and how the linguistic evidence shows that they seem to go back thousands of years. And it's really, really interesting. So there's your answer. I hope you found that interesting. If you like this, don't forget to click the like button and sign up for my newsletter. There's all kinds of cool stuff there. And we'll see you next time.